Coogs House. The Big 12 and our Houston Cougars start off March with a fun March Madness, but Brett Yormark, the commissioner, is out here publicly and bluntly talking about expansion.
You are Locked On Cougs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Cougs, daily podcast about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach Parker Ainsworth, to break down all things Cougs. If you're a U of H fan or just a hater who came to stop by, please be sure to subscribe down below. That we can latest on Cougs in your newsfeed each and every day. Appreciate you making Locked On Cougs your first listen of the day. And if you found us on YouTube, welcome back. It is so good to see you again. Remember, doing a giveaway every 500 subscribers these days. Hit subscribe, help us get there. Next one of those is almost at 2,100. The next one of those is at 2,500. Again, like, subscribe, let us know you're in that contest. If you don't know what to say at the end of this video, tell us what the weirdest flavor of chip, it's championship week in the Big 12, what's the weirdest flavor of chip you've ever had. I had pizza chips tonight. They were interesting. Didn't hate it, though. Didn't hate it. All right, today's episode is going to be a kind of smorgasbord feel, but a lot of like big picture college sports news, Big 12 news, and how it ties to Houston. Some big stories out there, and each of these has a tie to Houston. First, Brett Yormark spoke to the media on Tuesday about expanding college basketball in the NCAA tournament, amongst other things for the Big 12. Obviously, that has something to do with Houston. Second, I want to talk some about this Capitol Hill conversation with Nick Saban and a couple of senators and Congress folks talking about NIL and regulations and things there, and how that pertains to Houston. And last but not least, we got to tie it all back up with the conference expansion at the end, the Big 12 potentially expanding. The door is open for that potentially. A Dellinger piece came out into last week that covers that as well. So we got to hit each of these benchmarks at some point and talk about how they tie to Houston today. But first, the probably most direct tie to Houston was Brett Yormark on Tuesday, and talking about expanding March Madness. He acted like it feels imminent that the tournament is going to expand out to 76 teams from the current 68-team model. I think the most obvious way to do that would be by adding a handful of more what I would call play-in games to the tournament, and kind of keep it like a 64-team bracket with just more play-ins to get into the 64 teams. The way we have 68 now, but there are four. They call it the first round, but 4 play-in type of games between 11 seeds or between 16 seeds, right? Now, Yormark is in favor of this. I think it's interesting because as one of the Power 4 commissioners, he would theoretically have a lot of say and sway in it. And he points out that the Big 12, to the media, he told that the Big 12 be a benefactor of this as a leader in college basketball. Points out that the Big 12 is looking at getting realistically 9 teams in March Madness in the next week, that you could see that as high as 10 or 11 if like you had Cinderella type runs in the conference tournaments out of the Cincinnatis or the Kansas States or the whatever, right? And that's in this year's Big 12. That in next year, when you lose Texas and Oklahoma, but add in Arizona, Arizona State, Colorado, and Utah, and like Arizona's got like a top 6 program in the country in the AP poll. Colorado just signed a second 4-star in basketball of the 2024 class. Utah has had pros come out of there. Arizona State has had its own handful of pros. The James Hardens, Josh Christophers of the world have come through that program, right? These are theoretically powerful basketball programs, and adding more teams to the overall tournament just means, in Yormark's eyes, that more Big 12 teams will have an argument to get in, right? It's the deepest conference in America. He said that. I don't think anyone would disagree with that either. And it sounds like he's operating under the assumption that as they add more teams, the thing you're going to add is more power conference teams, because truthfully, some of those smaller conferences, their conference champion makes it in, they get bounced in the first round. It's kind of taken up a spot. And if you can put those into more play-in type games and let the big dogs play it out after that, I think you might have a point. Now, where I disagree with him in terms of Houston, as Houston presently stands, is that adding more rounds to this tournament adds more variance, more randomness. I have never been a person that feels confident that the best team in America wins the March Madness tournament every year. That's part of the fun, right? I don't mean to say that doesn't make it a fun tournament, but is intentionally set up in such a way that's a bunch of single game sample sizes, randomness. You break your shoelace and miss 5 minutes. That's 5 minutes of the 40-minute game, right? Someone gets in foul trouble. Someone gets a tooth knocked out, has to go back and get that, fixed in that locker room or whatever. Someone's sick for a week, right? All those different things apply to the randomness of, can you win 6 games against random opponents in March and early April and take home the trophy, right? Cut down the net to the end of it. Now, that is what makes it fun. That makes it exciting, right? But adding more teams to that only makes it more random. And Houston's gotten to a place where, honestly, year in, year out, they're going to be considered widely and rightfully one of the best teams in America in college basketball. Adding more randomness to that actually hurts them, because if it were less random, if you played 16 teams and said, hey, you're going to have a bunch of 3-game, best 2 out of 3 kind of situations, small series across or whatever, Houston would more likely win those. We've seen that this year, right? When Houston loses to Iowa State in the first game, beats them in the second one. Houston loses to Kansas by 13 at their place, blows them out by 30 at home in Fertitta, right? If you expanded this in terms of games played, but shrunk the number of teams, Houston would still make it because they're one of the best 16 teams in the country. They're the number 1 team in the country right now for good reason, right? But also, you'd be taking that randomness out. Adding more teams, adding more randomness, I do think hurts Houston in the long run. I get the fun aspect of it, and I frankly, 5 or 6 years ago, this Houston program that was getting to the point they're making the tournament more often, but not necessarily the top team in the country, I might have argued that this helps them, makes them more likely that they're going to make the tournament, right? And once you're in it, you got a chance to win. Anyone does, right? That's the fun of it. Just right now, with the program we've got built, it almost feels like ill timing. And it's I'll be interested to see where that goes. It sounds to Yormark fairly imminent, though. The other comment I'll say on Yormark's comment on Yormark's comments, that's that fun sentence to say. The other thing I'll say about it, though, is that he had a comment about officiating the Big 12, and he did not seem pleased with the way it went this past season, said that there would be some sort of an auditor look back at the season after the fact once the conference tournaments were over. Worth pointing out that 3 of the top 4 teams in the Big 12 saw their coaches tossed at various, Houston and Kelvin Sampson included, at some point this season due to arguments with officials. When Kansas State came to play Houston, I guess Jerome didn't get tossed out, but he had his own words that led to a fine ultimately in the post game. Across the board, I think the word would be inconsistent. I don't mean like some are good and some are bad. I mean like some calls were made and some calls were not when they seem very similar. And I don't know that I would call it cheating and that kind of a rhyme or reason to it, but it just seemed inconsistent. Like people need to get on the same page about what is and isn't contact, what isn't a foul. I've done my soliloquy there, but it does sound like Commissioner Yormark is looking into that, and sounds like the conference will be looking into that in the postseason as the best, after the season's over, I should say, after the postseason, as the best conference in college basketball. They need to also have the best officiating college basketball, and that was not the case. It sounds like they know that, and they're going to go work on that. He also spoke briefly about like this whole nonsense about the Big 12 gaming the net is absolutely ridiculous. It is ridiculous. There'll be a number of teams that Houston play in their weak non-conference schedule, in air quotes, including Stetson, that won their small school conference and making the tournament. Those are tournament type games, and we don't consider it like a, when Virginia loses in the first round against a 16 seed, we don't call, it's an upset, right? Teams can lose to those teams, and Houston's playing those kinds of small schools. A number of Big 12 schools are playing those kinds of small schools in their pre-conference slate as a way to get ready for the Big 12 gauntlet that is. Anyway, he put that to rest. I don't think we even need to talk about it too much more, because obviously we all agree there. But the tournament growing is a weird one. A less weird one, at least in 2024, on the surface, is that some folks in Washington talked about making money as college athletes. But what is weird about it in 2024 is one of those guys was a legendary football coach, I guess recently retired football coach, Nick Saban. I want to talk some about that in a minute. But first, Nick Saban put together some pretty good teams in his day. And if you're trying to put together a pretty good vehicle yourself, you got to have the best parts, just like he did. And passion, drive, and patience are what bring home the winning trophy and also keep your ride or die vehicle alive. eBay Motors has got everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers to roof racks, exhaust gates, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. Over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die. You'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your parts guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber and not cash. With all the parts you need and the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right. I mentioned the next day I went to Capitol. I should point out, as a Southern gentleman myself, he had an exquisite suit on. Nice teal. Very Nick Saban of him. But he spoke in front of a committee of Congress folks, including Texas Senator Ted Cruz in Washington, D.C. Now, I don't mean to mix politics and sports. They were talking about how to potentially regulate people making money as college athletes. And I do think that's, while it was talked with politicians about politicians and with whatever, it pertains to what we're doing here right now. The argument boiled down to, yes, I think everyone in the room agreed that college athletes should get paid something, but should they be considered employees, right? Nick Saban argued adamantly that they should not. Greg Byrne, his former athletic director, Jim Phillips, in charge of the ACC, also both spoke and essentially asked for legislation that helps regulate what is and isn't okay, because right now the NCAA is kind of functioning like the wild, wild west with NIL money, right? Nick Saban told a number of stories about what happened in the last couple of years of his 50-year coaching career in college and pro football. And he mentioned a couple of different times that NIL collectives led by boosters have essentially become pay for play, and insinuated that in recruiting and talking to kids in the transfer portal, not that he was doing it necessarily illegally or beforehand or whatever. People can draw their lines of connections. He does not seem like that. He did not say those kinds of things. But even in legal conversations, you had a lot of conversations that were not about when will I get on the field, how can you get me to the league, et cetera, but about where am I going to get the money from? How much money am I going to get? Right. And he said after the season was over, talked with his wife, Miss Terry. And I love, on a side note, that he calls his wife in the courtroom Miss Terry, because everyone in the SEC calls her Mrs. Terry. And frankly, Mrs. Terry and Nick Saban just strike me as a very wholesome Southern couple in a lot of ways. Right, in a lot of ways. And apparently the conversation went like this. I pulled this off of a Ross Dellinger article. The quote was that she said all of the players care about is how much you're going to pay them. They don't care about how you're going to develop them, which is what we've always done, per Saban. Why are we doing this? He finished. That was the kind of red alert. We really are creating a circumstance that's not beneficial to the development of young people, which is why I always did what I did. And he would finish, ultimately led to his retirement. Byrne, again, athletic director, spoke up as well and said the biggest thing to him was that there was a system with no rules, that every school was kind of functioning on what they thought was best, and different schools had different thoughts of what they thought was best. And I think it's interesting is that Byrne and Phillips, as opposed to what Saban said, brought up that it can't be a 100% pay for play from the schools as employees, because a lot of the revenue that those sports bring in go into other parts of the athletic department. And you can't just redistribute 100% of the revenue, because then you're going to end up losing other non-revenue sports. And he was saying you go from as quickly in a single year going from 20 down to 6, just like that, because the revenues get distributed differently. Now, I have a couple different thoughts on this. I have my Houston thoughts and my big picture thoughts. And a Houston moment, and this is Locked on Cougs, I would point out that I think a regulated system with, investigations and scrutiny and stuff could actually help Houston, right? In a big city like the city of Houston, it's a lot harder for things to go under the table, right? There's a reason that schools like Houston, SMU, USC, Miami, they've all been hit much harder. Even to some degree, I think UT also get at some point, right? Like all have been hit some much harder by different things like that, as opposed to schools in the middle of nowhere, where the entire economy revolves of the city, town, region revolves around a college football program. People kind of look the other way on things, right? That's just the nature of the beast, right? But not only the regulations, if they're enforced equally across the board, I think help Houston in that sense. I think they also help Houston because, frankly, it kind of tells everyone exactly what rules to play with. And I think those rules be kind of closer to the game Houston's playing than the game that some of these outlandish programs that have had, millions and millions of dollars growing years and years and years, where Houston's kind of following this fast track to Power 5 status and really trying to speed up the process and may have to kick into hyperspeed to get there still. I think that the place that the rules be set at is closer to what Houston's doing than what other schools are doing. All of that is to say that regulation would help set the bar and we would know where to get to, right? And I frankly think it should be pointed out that, like, as a successful program on campus, what Gosling has got going on for the men's basketball program as an NIL guy trying to get all the collectives, and like the guys are getting very well taken care of as a reward of their results, right? And I think that should always be kind of the centerpiece of this is like, listen, it's name, image, and likeness, but Jamal Shed gets a deal with Exxon because he's the best player in America, and people want to associate excellence with Exxon, right? Like that's the deal, right? At a secondary level, this is my little soapbox piece here. When talking about revenue sports and making money, and this won't make that much cash, and that won't make enough cash for this, and I always hit pause. I always hesitate. I hate to look at athletics or anything on a college campus in terms of, well, if it doesn't make enough money, if it doesn't make positive money, we can't do it. Because I feel fairly firmly, call me crazy in the comments if you wish, go for it, that no aspect of a college, certainly not a public institution, should be looking at maximizing profit as a source of revenue. Like, make money put back into the school, that's one thing, right? And if there is any revenue, I totally am for finding a way to funnel that into the people that earned it. But if we're going to start cutting athletic programs like Greg Burns said, because they don't make money and we can't find a way to make it work, I not only think that's bogus, I think that's a dangerous line, because that same line of thinking on the athletic department could be carried over into every aspect of the college, right? If at a college level, you're like, well, we can't keep this Olympic sport because, equestrian just doesn't have the revenue sharing that makes it worth it. At what point do you cut the English department? At what point do you cut theology? At what point do you cut things that maybe don't lead to necessarily as many millionaires or whatever that send money back to the school? And like, listen, we have to cut this entire academic department because it's not profitable for the school. Ultimately, we decide we're going to go into more things that are profitable for the school. So we have to cut this, this integral part that has a bunch of kids coming here to go to school, but they're going to go be teachers. They're going to go be nurses. They're going to go be great citizens, and not necessarily focus on making money in a way that's going to lead to a lot of donations back to the school. So we're just going to cut the program. That's a dangerous line of thinking. And I know it feels so far-fetched in March of 2024, but if you'd asked me in March of 2018 if we were going to be paying players by 2024, I'd have called you crazy. I think these things move fast. I think that's a dangerous line to flirt with, and I'm not sure it's one I'm in complete favor of. Now, I will say that when you're talking about dangerous lines, one thing that people might want to do on being a little dangerous or feeling a little frisky with things is maybe put some money where their mouth is this March. And if that is you, if that's what you're thinking about, I'm telling you, you got to go to FanDuel.com/locked on to do it, because right now they got all kinds of cool deals. But if you put down $5 and that bet hits and you're at promo code locked on, You get $150 back in bonus bets. They got all kinds of same game parlays. You can do all kinds of individual aspects of the game. You can also just go to the tournament as a whole. The odds for Houston are kind of getting almost to 50, like almost to just getting your money back if they make the Final Four, right? Big 12 tournament odds, NCAA championship odds, NBA, baseball's coming around the corner. Anything you're looking for, you can find it at FanDuel. Make it a little more interesting and put your money where your mouth is. So go check out FanDuel right now. Make that first bet a layup. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. All right, I think the thing that, and this was actually into last week, which is why it's kind of the end of the show here. But the other piece of like big college sports news is that it feels like by the end of March, we may have some answers towards more conference expansion. I put this at the end here because I know people that wanted to stick around for it, and people that didn't, I'd like to sit here and talk to you more. So please stick around, but I also get it, right? Now, conference expansion feels like the never-ending saga in college sports. We're trying to consolidate and make things, and ultimately, what it looks like is happening is a college football playoff based on a Dellinger article from last week, Dellinger of the Yahoo Sports. Feels like there's multiple deals being looked at for the future of the college football playoff, and that's going to end up shaping this whole thing, because in each deal, you could see as early as 2028 different looks at how many teams make the tournament. We're already looking at an expanded field next year that could be expanded even more just a couple years down the line. You could look at deals where you're having it's like 3 for the Big Ten, 3 for the SEC, 2 for the ACC, 2 for the Big 12, and then 4 at large. Another model has 2 Big Ten, 2 SEC, 1 ACC, 1 Big 12, and 8 at large. In both instances, the at large category includes at least one guaranteed group of 5 team to kind of keep them involved in it. The expansion of the bracket means more playoff games. More playoff games means more revenue. Revenue goes bigger and broader across the board here. The Big Ten and the SEC are getting the bigger chunk of it, looks like, based on the projected structures, as high as 58% of the pot going to those two conferences. The Big 12 and ACC will be splitting a 31% chunk of the pot. So again, considerably different. And what that is leading to ultimately is this discussion and a lawsuit that is, set to hit trial in late March, the 22nd actually, so fairly soon. And it looks like Florida State is going to use all of this as evidence for the ACC not holding up their end of the bargain and operating in a way that is best for this university, right? Florida State, this is not a Florida State show, so I'm going to try and hit it quickly and through the layperson parts, but is the trustees at Florida State are suing the ACC for mismanaging the media rights deal and their draconian exit fees. And that's a quote, draconian. The uncompetitiveness before the suit is antithetical to what the point of being in a conference is. And essentially, they're trying to sue, and even if it costs a lot of money, millions of dollars in legal fees, to pay less to get out of the conference through the suit and just pull themselves out, then the fee would be to leave based on the guarantee of rights. The guarantee of rights would cost $130 million flat plus $400 in paybacks over the next, about a dozen years till 2036. Obviously, the closer they got to 2036, that 400 would shrink. But right now, you're looking at, like, after you add on a couple fees to it, like upward closer to $580 million based on when it officially went through to leave the conference. They're hoping that this lawsuit would theoretically cost less and have the same result. Now, still cost millions, but have the same result and cost a lot less than, almost $600 million. The interesting thing for Houston's Big 12, and I said each of these segments is going to come back to that, right, is that Houston just joined the expanded Big 12, and the Big 12 is making a fairly sizable chunk. Again, in the ACC, will be splitting 31% of that future college football playoff payout, right? As it appears, if Florida State were to win this suit and move forward and actually leave the ACC, they'd probably join the SEC and probably have nothing to do with Houston, except it would set a precedent that a lot of other big name and big brands could follow, right? If Florida State can find a couple $100 million to get through the suit and get out and not have to pay the full $600 or whatever it is, then theoretically, why wouldn't Miami? Why wouldn't Clemson? Why wouldn't Carolina? Right? You could go down Pitt, Virginia Tech, etc. Right? A bunch of schools could find their way out of this thing with Florida State as a precedent. And for what it's worth, the lawsuit starts. The Florida version of this lawsuit at home to Florida State starts in March 22nd. But there's also a case happening in North Carolina, headquarters of the ACC, in May. And so it looks like you're going to have like a couple different things going back and forth. You could hit circuits. This thing could keep on moving. This thing might not be solved by 2025, let alone this fall, right? But if it sets the precedent that Florida State can get out, we'll know fairly early on, I think, in this first trial if this is going to be successful or not, right? If it sets that precedent, then you're going to have other schools say, this costs $130 million, not 600. Let's do it, and then get out, right? And then it's like, well, where do they go? How big does the Big 12 want to go? How big does the Big 10 want to go? How big does the SEC want to go, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? What schools fit kind of naturally into the culture of which conferences and all that jazz. That is where this thing ties into Houston, because there'll be several schools coming into the Big 12 that cultural fits. I think Virginia Tech is a great one. I think NC State is a great one. I think Pitt is a great one, right? You could keep a rivalry going with Pitt and West Virginia. You could add states in each of those categories, right, to make sure that the conference's footprint was bigger from a TV right perspective, right? That's all to be tackled down the road. But what it does sound like is that, per Dellinger last week, that Yormark was mentioned by name as someone that might be ready. If you remember last time, we were talking about adding the Colorados and the Arizonas of the world. The conference's deal is written in such that a lot of Power 5 schools look at the Big 12 as a chance to make a sizable chunk of money, even if it's just between now and the end of this TV deal in 2030. And they would also know that the new conference would have a new deal in 2030. And if they could bolster the conference and strengthen it, that deal would be worth a lot of money. Whereas if they got smaller chunks of the pie in the Big 10 or SEC, depending on what time they got out of the ACC, that could seem as not a valuable a deal. So I say all that to say that it does seem like if this Florida State lawsuit goes a certain way, you could have a lot of movement, including new Big 12 schools. Now, what'll be interesting is with the way that college football playoff piece is divided up, right, where 58% gets divided between the Big 10 and SEC, and 31% goes to the Big 12 and ACC. Well, if there's no ACC, now Big 12 is not going to get all 31%, but that 31% is suddenly more than either half of the 58%, right? And so how do those payouts work out? How does that change up? Can the Big 12 make it a Big 3 very suddenly? It becomes a real conversation because two of the other Power 5 conferences would have dissolved in a matter of, 18 months, right? And that is important and impactful in revenues because that's going to change what money comes in and what money gets spent on buildings and locker rooms and potentially, as the lawsuit pointed out, players and so on, right? And so I say that to say that I know it's Florida State and I know it's the ACC, but keep an eye on that trial happening starting later this month. Now, that's a lot of college sports news. If you got other things you want to talk about, if you got other Cougar things you want to discuss, if you got other commentary, if you want to just tell me that I'm crazy, tell me in the comments down below. I love talking to you guys each and every morning. Locked on Coogs is a proud Locked On podcast. That means your team, our Cougs, are number one in America. Big 12, Houston Cougars every day. Go Cougs.